Picture this. It's a fog-shrouded evening in 1863. You're walking down a narrow cobblestone street where the East River's tide still seeps through the cracks, making the stones slick under your boots. The air reeks of rotting fish, human waste, and something else. Something that makes your stomach churn. Behind you, the muffled sounds of the Civil War rage on. But here, in this forgotten corner of Manhattan, a different kind of war has been raging for decades. Welcome to Water Street, Manhattan's most dangerous place. You hear a scream pierce the night air from somewhere up ahead. Then sudden silence. A shadow moves in a doorway, or was it just your imagination? Every instinct tells you to turn around, to flee back to the safety of the better neighborhoods uptown. But you can't, because tonight you're about to discover what life was really like in the place that polite society pretended didn't exist. Before we descend into this forgotten underworld, make sure you hit that like button if you're ready to explore the dark corners of history that your textbooks never told you about. Subscribe and ring that notification bell, because we're about to uncover stories that will fundamentally change how you think about New York City's past. And in the comments, let me know what forgotten neighborhood from history would you want us to explore next. Forget everything you think you know about 1860s Manhattan. Forget the romantic images of horse-drawn carriages and elegant Victorian ladies strolling through gaslit streets, because where we're going tonight, the gas lamps have been smashed, the carriages don't dare to venture, and the only ladies you'll encounter are the ones who've had to sell everything, including their souls, just to survive another day. This is the story of Water Street in Manhattan's 4th Ward, a place where the American dream didn't just die, it was murdered, chopped up and fed to the rats. You're standing at the intersection of Water Street and Dover Street in Lower Manhattan, and the year is Abraham Lincoln is president. The Civil War is tearing the nation apart, and New York City is experiencing the most explosive growth in its history. But down here in this maze of narrow streets pressed against the East River, it feels like you've stepped into a different world entirely. The street beneath your feet earned its name for a reason that most New Yorkers have forgotten. At high tide, the East River would literally wash over this roadway, flooding the cobblestones and seeping into the basements of the ramshackle buildings that lined both sides. The city had pushed the shoreline back with landfill by the 1860s, but the name stuck, and so did the dampness, the smell, and the sense that this place existed somewhere between land and sea, between civilization and chaos. Water Street stretched from Whitehall Street in the south to Corlier's Hook in the north, cutting through what was officially called the 4th Ward. But to anyone who lived there, it might as well have been another planet. This wasn't just Manhattan's poorest neighborhood. It was, according to police records of the time, the most dangerous place in America. The buildings that crowded along Water Street told the story of a city growing too fast for its own good. What had once been single-family homes for prosperous merchants had been carved up, subdivided, and subdivided again into what people called tenements, though that word doesn't capture the reality of what these places actually were. Imagine living in a space smaller than most people's closets today, sharing it with 8 or 10 other people, with no running water, no indoor plumbing, and walls so thin you could hear every conversation, every argument, every desperate sob from your neighbors. But the physical squalor was nothing compared to what human desperation had created in these streets. You see, Water Street wasn't just residential, it was Manhattan's maritime heart. The place where ships from around the world docked to unload their cargo. Every day, thousands of sailors, stevedores, merchants, and drifters flowed through these streets like a human tide. And where you have that many transient men with money in their pockets and no ties to the community, Certain kinds of businesses inevitably spring up to serve them. The ground floors of most buildings housed saloons, boarding houses, dance halls, and establishments that advertised female companionship. Above them, crammed into spaces that would make a modern prison cell seem spacious, lived the workers, the unemployed, the recently arrived immigrants, and those who had simply fallen through the cracks of a rapidly changing society. To understand Water Street, you have to understand that by 1863, New York City's population had exploded from about 205,000 people in 1820 to nearly 1 million. Most of that growth came from European immigrants fleeing poverty and famine, particularly from Ireland and Germany. These weren't the wealthy settlers who had founded colonial America. These were desperate people who arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever hope they could muster. The city's infrastructure simply couldn't handle this massive influx. There wasn't enough housing, there weren't enough jobs, and there certainly wasn't enough concern from the city's established elite about what happened to these new arrivals. So they crowded into neighborhoods like the Fourth Ward, where landlords quickly learned they could make more money cramming 20 people into a space designed for one family than they could renting to respectable tenants. But Water Street was more than just overcrowded. It was lawless. The New York City Police Department, which had only been officially organized in 1845, was understaffed, undertrained, and in many cases simply afraid to venture into certain parts of the Fourth Ward. Police Superintendent George Metzel described the area in 1850 as harboring criminals who pursue their nefarious operations with the most systematic perseverance, and manifest a shrewdness and adroitness which can only be attained by long practice. The police estimated that by the 1860s more than 30,000 people lived in the Fourth Ward's maze of tenements, boarding houses and cellars. Of those, law enforcement believed that at least 10,000 were actively involved in criminal activity. That wasn't counting the thousands more who engaged in what we might charitably call morally ambiguous professions: the prostitutes, the gamblers, the loan sharks, and the proprietors of establishments that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal. But statistics can't capture what it felt like to walk down Water Street as darkness fell. The buildings seemed to lean in toward each other, blocking out most of the sky and creating a perpetual twilight even in the middle of the day. Laundry lines stretched between the upper floors, draped with clothes that never seemed to fully dry in the perpetually damp air. The narrow sidewalks, when they existed at all, were cluttered with barrels, crates, refuse, and sleeping bodies that you had to step around or over. The smell hit you first, a combination of rotting garbage, human waste, dead fish from the nearby markets, and the acrid smoke that poured from the countless small factories and workshops crammed into cellars and back rooms. Open sewers ran down the middle of many streets, carrying away waste that often overflowed during heavy rains or high tides. Every few steps, you'd pass another saloon identifiable by the raucous noise spilling out through doors that never seemed to fully close. These weren't the genteel taverns found in better neighborhoods. These were dim, smoky caves where men gathered to drink rot-gut whiskey, place bets on rat fights, and plot their next schemes. The boarding houses were even more depressing. For a few cents a night, a man could rent space in a communal room where dozens of workers slept side by side on straw mattresses or simply on the floor. Privacy didn't exist. Safety was a luxury no one could afford. And if you couldn't pay your few cents, you slept in the street, assuming the gangs let you live that long. But perhaps the most unnerving thing about Water Street was the sense that you were being watched. From every doorway, every window, every shadow, eyes followed your movement. The residents had developed an almost supernatural awareness of strangers, of potential threats, of opportunities. In a place where survival often depended on being the predator rather than the prey, everyone was constantly sizing up everyone else. The children were perhaps the most heartbreaking sight. Dirty, thin, dressed in rags, They seemed to age decades in their first few years of life. Many had never been to school. Their parents couldn't afford to lose the few pennies a child might earn running errands or picking through garbage. Instead, they learned the streets, developing skills that would serve them well in the harsh economy of the Fourth Ward, but would mark them as outcasts if they ever tried to leave. To make matters worse, the Fourth Ward existed in a state of almost constant conflict, not just the petty crimes and individual violence you might expect from desperate poverty, but organized warfare between rival gangs, ethnic groups, and criminal enterprises. The boundaries between different territories were invisible to outsiders, but absolutely clear to residents, and crossing the wrong street at the wrong time could easily cost you your life. The city's elite, the merchants, bankers, and politicians who lived in the fashionable neighborhoods uptown knew about the Fourth Ward, of course, but they preferred to think of it as a necessary evil, a place where the unfortunate classes could be contained while the rest of the city prospered. Occasionally a reform movement would sweep through, promising to clean up the neighborhood, but these efforts invariably fizzled out when the reformers encountered the sheer scope of the problems they were trying to solve. And so Water Street festered, a cancerous growth on Manhattan's waterfront, where human misery had been concentrated and left to ferment into something far more dangerous than simple poverty. But to truly understand what life was like on Water Street, you need to know about the people who made their living there, not just the victims of circumstance, but the predators who had learned to thrive in this urban wilderness. Because in the 1860s, Water Street was home to some of the most colorful, violent, and notorious criminals in American history, starting with a 6-foot-tall woman who collected human ears in a jar behind her bar. You're walking down Water Street and you come to number 2079. A blood-red, 3-story wooden building that seems to sag under the weight of its own corruption. The structure dates back to 1794, making it one of the oldest buildings in Manhattan, but age hasn't brought it dignity. If anything, the decades have only made it more sinister. A crooked sign hangs above the door, "The Hole in the Wall Saloon," but you don't need to read the sign to know you've found one of New York's most infamous establishments. The raucous noise pouring out through the doors, the rough-looking men stumbling in and out, and the unmistakable aura of violence and vice tell you everything you need to know. This is Gallus Mag's place, and Gallus Mag is not someone you want to meet on a dark night, or any night, for that matter. Margaret Perry, though everyone on Water Street knows her simply as Gallus Mag, stands 6 feet tall in an era when most men barely reach 5'6". She's built like a stevedore, with shoulders that could break down doors and hands that have done exactly that on numerous occasions. Her face is weathered and hard, marked by years of violence, and the kind of life that ages a person decades beyond their actual year. But it's not her size that makes Gallus Mag the most feared person on Water Street, it's her reputation. The nickname Gallus comes from the suspenders, or galluses as they were called, that she wears to hold up her trousers. Yes, trousers. In 1863, when respectable women wouldn't dream of showing their ankles, Gallus Mag dresses like a man, and fights like a man, and fights like a man who has nothing left to lose. She keeps a small leather sack filled with wet sand hanging from her belt, her weapon of choice for knocking unruly customers unconscious. But that's just the beginning of her arsenal. When things get really violent, Gallus Mag has been known to bite off the ears of troublemakers, and she keeps these gruesome trophies in a pickle jar behind the bar. You think I'm exaggerating? Frank Moss, the reform attorney who documented the horrors of New York's underworld, described the hole in the wall as a bagnio filled with river pirates and Water Street hags, where thieves and junk men would meet to put up jobs, where men were drugged and robbed and women beaten, where young thieves became graduates in crime, and Gallus Mag ruled over it all with an iron fist and a complete disregard for human life. The hole in the wall isn't just a saloon,
It's the unofficial headquarters for some of Manhattan's most dangerous criminal enterprises. River pirates meet here to plan their raids on ships anchored in the harbor. Thieves gather to fence stolen goods. Murderers come to find alibis and make new enemies. And through it all, Gallus Mag maintains order through a combination of terror and brutal efficiency. Her husband Jack Perry is supposedly the co-owner, but everyone knows who really runs the show. Jack has his own claims to fame. He's a skilled thief, whose greatest achievement was stealing a champion rowing belt from Josh Ward. But he's content to let his wife handle the day-to-day management of their criminal empire. A typical night at the Hole in the Wall begins as the sun sets and the darkness gives cover to activities that even the Fourth Ward's relaxed moral standards couldn't tolerate in daylight. Sailors stumble in, their pockets heavy with months of back pay, looking for liquor, companionship, and a warm place to spend the night. They have no idea they've walked into one of the most dangerous rooms in America. The building's layout facilitates crime. The saloon occupies the ground floor, with its bar running along one wall and rough wooden tables scattered throughout the room. Upstairs, a maze of small rooms serves as a brothel, where women who have long since given up hope of any other life sell what's left of their dignity for the few coins that might keep them alive. Another day. But it's the basement that truly reveals the building's sinister purpose. Hidden beneath the main floor, accessible through a trapdoor behind the bar, lies a warren of interconnected cellars and tunnels. Some connect to the nearby waterfront, allowing criminals to move goods and people without being seen by police. Others lead to storage areas where stolen merchandise waits to be sold or shipped to other cities.
The most notorious feature of these cellars is what the regulars call the Hole, a pit where troublemakers are thrown and left to reconsider their actions. Many who disappear into the hole are never seen again. The lucky ones emerge days later, beaten, robbed, and stripped of everything they owned, grateful just to be alive. Gallus Mag's methods for maintaining order in this chaos are legendary throughout the Fourth Ward. When a sailor gets too drunk and starts causing trouble, she doesn't call for help. She handles the situation herself. Witnesses describe her picking up grown men and throwing them bodily out of the saloon, sometimes through the windows if the door is too crowded. But her signature move is what Water Street residents call the Gallus Mag Special. When someone really angers her, she grabs them by the ear, drags them outside, and bites the ear clean off. The victim is then banned from the establishment, and Gallus Mag adds another trophy to her pickle jar collection. The pickle jar itself has become the stuff of legend. Sitting on a shelf behind the bar, it contains dozens of human ears preserved in brine, each one representing someone who learned the hard way that you don't cross Gallus Mag. Regulars at the Hole in the Wall sometimes dare newcomers to count the ears, but few have the stomach to examine the jar closely enough to get an accurate count. To make matters worse, Gallus Mag doesn't limit her violence to her own establishment. She's been known to patrol Water Street at night, settling disputes and enforcing her own brutal version of justice throughout the neighborhood. Property owners pay her protection money. Competing saloons give her a cut of their profit. Even the gangs that terrorize the rest of Manhattan know better than to cause trouble on Gallus Mag's stretch of Water Street. Her influence extends far beyond simple muscle, though. The Hole in the Wall serves as an informal courthouse for the Fourth Ward's criminal community. When disputes arise between rival gangs, when thieves argue over territory, when prostitutes have problems with violent customers, they often bring their problems to Gallus Mag. Her decisions are final, and everyone knows that crossing her means risking not just their livelihood, but their lives. The authorities are powerless to stop her. The few police officers brave enough to venture into the Fourth Ward know that arresting Gallus Mag would require an army, and even then she'd probably be back on the street within days. Too many people owe her money. Too many politicians benefit from the relative peace she maintains in her territory, and too many judges have been bought off by the criminal enterprises that depend on her protection. But perhaps the most disturbing thing about Gallus Mag isn't her violence, It's how normal that violence has become to the people who live and work on Water Street. Customers at the hole-in-the-wall step casually around bloodstains on the floor. Prostitutes joke about the contents of the pickle jar. Sailors who've lost ears to Gallus Mag's teeth return to the saloon as if nothing happened, knowing that there's nowhere else in the neighborhood where they can find the particular combination of services they're looking for. The building itself seems to absorb and amplify the violence that occurs within its walls. The wooden floors are stained black with spilled blood, alcohol, and things that don't bear thinking about. The walls are pockmarked with bullet holes, knife scars, and the impacts of human bodies thrown with tremendous force. The air carries a permanent odor of fear, desperation, and death that no amount of cleaning could ever eliminate. Yet the hole in the wall remains packed every night. Sailors need somewhere to drink away the memories of months at sea. Thieves need somewhere to plan their next jobs. River pirates need somewhere to recruit new crew members. And everyone in the Fourth Ward needs somewhere they can go where their past doesn't matter and their future is measured in hours rather than years. Gallus Mag provides that service, and she's become wealthy doing it. Unlike many of the criminals who operate in the Fourth Ward, she's not motivated by desperation or survival. She's built a thriving business empire based on humanity's darkest impulses. She owns property throughout the neighborhood, has investments in other criminal enterprises, and commands a network of informants and enforcers that would make a political boss envious. But even Gallus Mag's reign can't last forever. The Fourth Ward is changing. Slowly but inevitably, reform movements are gaining strength. The police department is growing more professional and less corruptible. Most importantly, the economic forces that created the neighborhood's unique ecosystem of crime and desperation are beginning to shift as Manhattan's development pushes northward. For now, though, Gallus Mag remains the undisputed queen of Water Street, and anyone foolish enough to challenge her authority quickly learns why her pickle jar keeps getting fuller. Just a few blocks away, another establishment offers its own unique brand of entertainment, one that would make even modern audiences squeamish. 3 blocks south of Gallus Mag's domain at 27-3 Water Street stands another 3-story brick building that looks unremarkable from the outside. But step through the doors of what locals call Sportsman's Hall, and you enter a world that would horrify even the most jaded modern observer. This is Kit Burns' empire, a place where human cruelty has been refined into an art form and packaged as entertainment. Christopher Kit Burns is a short, portly man with a pockmarked face, and the kind of jovial demeanor that makes him seem harmless at first glance. He dresses well, speaks politely to customers, and runs his establishment with the efficiency of a legitimate businessman. But Kit Burns has built his fortune on one of the most disturbing forms of entertainment ever conceived: organized animal fighting taken to its most extreme and sadistic conclusion. Sportsman's Hall is famous throughout New York, and infamous throughout the civilized world for its rat pit. Imagine a circular pit about 6 feet in diameter, sunk into the floor and surrounded by tiers of wooden benches where spectators crowd together shouting bets and encouragement. The pit itself is painted white to make blood stains more visible, and its sides are just high enough to prevent the rats from escaping but low enough for everyone to see the carnage clearly. Every night, Kit Burns releases hundreds of live rats into this pit, then sends in specially trained dogs to kill them while spectators bet on how many rats each dog can slaughter in a given time period. The record, according to Burns' carefully kept statistics, is 100 rats killed by a single dog in 5 minutes and 28 seconds. But rat baiting is just the beginning. Kit Burns has expanded his business to include dog fights, cockfights, and contests that combine different species in ways that nature never intended. He's hosted battles between cats and rats, dogs and wild cats, and in one notorious event that scandalized even the Fourth Ward's jaded residents, a trained bear against a pack of dogs. The basement beneath Sportsman's Hall houses Burns' breeding operation, where he raises the animals that provide his twisted entertainment.
Hundreds of rats live in cages fed just enough to keep them healthy for fighting but not enough to make them complacent. The dogs are trained from puppyhood to kill efficiently and brutally, their natural instincts honed into weapons through careful conditioning and deliberate cruelty. Kit Burns learned the business from Yankee Sullivan, one of New York's most famous bare-knuckle boxers, who taught him that violence sells better than almost anything else. But Burns has proven to be an even better businessman than his mentor, expanding from simple animal fights to create what amounts to an entertainment complex dedicated to blood sport. The typical evening at Sportsman's Hall begins around 8 o'clock when the first customers start arriving. These aren't just the desperate residents of the Fourth Ward. Burns attracts spectators from throughout Manhattan, including wealthy businessmen from uptown who come slumming in search of thrills they can't find in their respectable neighborhood. The main floor of Sportsman's Hall functions as a saloon and restaurant, where customers can eat, drink, and place their bets before the evening's entertainment begins. Burns serves decent food at reasonable prices, understanding that men are more likely to spend money on gambling and liquor if they're well fed first. The atmosphere is almost festive, with customers sharing stories of previous fights and debating the merits of different dogs. But the real money is made downstairs in the basement fighting pit. Burns charges admission to watch the contests, takes a percentage of all bets placed, and sells overpriced drinks to spectators who work themselves into a frenzy watching animals tear each other apart. On a good night, he can clear more profit than most legitimate businesses make in a month. The brutality of these contests is difficult to describe without seeming sensationalistic, but it's important to understand just how far removed from normal human behavior Kit Burns's establishment really was. The rats, bred specifically for fighting, are kept hungry and terrified to make them more aggressive. When released into the pit, they don't flee, they attack, driven by desperation and trained instinct. The dogs, meanwhile, have been conditioned to kill not just efficiently but enthusiastically. Burns and his assistants train them using techniques that would make modern animal abusers look humane by comparison. Dogs that don't show sufficient bloodlust are culled from the breeding program. Those that show promise are rewarded with meat from their victims, creating a psychological association between killing and satisfaction that becomes stronger with each contest. The spectators are almost as disturbing as the contests themselves. Men who appear respectable in their daily lives scream for blood with a fervor that borders on madness. They bet not just on which animal will win, but on how many wounds each animal will suffer, how long the contest will last, and whether any of the rats will manage to inflict serious injury on the dogs before dying. To make matters worse, Burns has created a tier system for his entertainment that caters to different levels of wealth and depravity. Regular admission gets you standing room around the pit. Premium seating puts you in the front row where you can see every drop of blood. But for his wealthiest customers, Burns offers private viewing boxes and the opportunity to suggest specific matchups or modifications to the standard contests. Some of these modifications are almost too horrific to describe. Burns has hosted contests where rats have been deliberately injured before being released, making them easier prey but prolonging their suffering. He's organized fights between pregnant animals, with spectators betting on whether the offspring will survive the carnage. In one particularly notorious event, he pitted a dog against rats that had been soaked in oil and set on fire. The financial success of Sportsman's Hall has made Kit Burns one of the wealthiest men in the Fourth Ward, but it's also made him one of the most hated. Even in a neighborhood where violence is commonplace and mercy is a luxury few can afford, many residents find Burns' business genuinely disturbing. The screams of dying animals can be heard through the building's walls at all hours of the night, and the smell of blood and death permeates the surrounding area. Burns himself seems genuinely oblivious to the moral implications of his business. He speaks of his animals with the pride of a craftsman, discussing his tools, carefully tracking their breeding lines, fighting records, and training progress. He's developed an elaborate system for rating dogs based on their killing efficiency, and he's genuinely proud of the innovations he's introduced to make the contests more exciting for spectators. The man has no children of his own, but he's taken several street orphans under his wing, teaching them to care for the fighting animals and assist with the betting operation. These children, some as young as 8 or 9, have grown up surrounded by organized cruelty and seem to view it as completely normal. They can discuss the finer points of rat baiting with the casual expertise that other children might bring to talking about their favorite toys. Burns's relationship with law enforcement is complex. Technically, many of his activities violate New York's animal cruelty laws, but those laws are rarely enforced in the Fourth Ward. More importantly, Burns is careful to cultivate relationships with police officers, politicians and judges, offering them free entertainment and occasionally more tangible benefits in exchange for looking the other way. He's also smart enough to understand that his business depends on maintaining at least the appearance of legitimacy. Sportsman's Hall is licensed as a saloon and restaurant. The animal fighting happens in the basement, technically on private property where the city's jurisdiction is questionable, and Burns is always careful to frame his contests as sporting events rather than simple cruelty, emphasizing the skill and training involved rather than the suffering of the animals. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Kit Burns' operation is how it reflects the broader dehumanization that pervades life in the Fourth Ward. In a neighborhood where human life has so little value, where people kill each other over pocket change and children grow up expecting to die young, the systematic torture of animals for entertainment seems almost inevitable. The customers who pack Sportsman's Hall every night aren't monsters, they're ordinary people who have been brutalized by circumstances beyond their control. The violence they inflict on animals is in many ways the violence that has been inflicted on them by a society that has abandoned them to fend for themselves in conditions that would challenge the survival instincts of wild beasts. Kit Burns has simply recognized this reality and found a way to profit from it. He's created a space where people can exercise the cruelty that their daily lives have beaten into them, channeling it in directions that don't threaten the social order. Better to have them taking their frustrations out on rats and dogs than on each other, or worse, on the wealthy residents of uptown Manhattan who benefit from the economic system that created the Fourth Ward's misery. As you leave Sportsman's Hall and continue down Water Street, the screams of dying animals echo behind you, mixing with the sounds of human suffering that permeate every corner of this urban nightmare. But even Kit Burns' organized cruelty pales in comparison to the systematic exploitation that awaits you just a few doors down. Because in the Fourth Ward, human life is cheaper than rat life, and some entrepreneurs have built entire industries around that terrible reality.
You're walking past a series of boarding houses along Water Street when a hand grabs your shoulder from behind. Before you can turn around, you catch a whiff of something sweet and chemical. Chloral hydrate mixed with cheap whiskey. The last thing you remember is someone saying, "Welcome aboard, sailor," in a voice that sounds like it's coming from very far away. When you wake up, you're in the cramped, dark hold of a ship that's already miles from shore, surrounded by 24 other men who are slowly coming to the same horrific realization. You've been shang-yu. This is the specialty of Tommy Hadden, known throughout the Fourth Ward as the Lime Juicer. Not because of his nationality, but because of his legendary skill at drugging drinks with the same casual ease that a bartender might squeeze a lime into a gin and tonic. In his 25-year career, police estimate that Hadden kidnapped and sold at least 1,000 men to ship captains desperate for crew members. Tommy Hadden doesn't look like a monster. He's a small, wiry man with a wandering eye and the kind of forgettable face that helps him blend into crowds. He dresses like a respectable tradesman and speaks with the educated accent of someone who's seen better days. But Tommy Hadden has turned human trafficking into a science, and he's made a fortune perfecting techniques that would make modern organized crime bosses take notes. The Shang-Yu-Cade exists because of a simple economic reality. Ships need crews, but sailors are in short supply. Ocean voyages can last months or even years. The work is dangerous and exhausting, and the pay, when it comes at all, is barely enough to survive on. Faced with these conditions, many experienced sailors choose to work on coastal vessels or find employment on land rather than sign up for deep-sea voyages. Ship captains, meanwhile, face enormous financial pressure to maintain their schedules. A ship sitting in port costs money every day, and delay can mean the difference between profit and bankruptcy. So when they can't find enough volunteers to crew their vessels, many captains are willing to pay premium prices for men who've been recruited through less conventional means. And to the Shangyusters, men like Tommy Haddon who specialize in providing unwilling crew members to captains who don't ask too many questions about recruitment methods. Haddon operates out of a series of boarding houses and saloons along Water Street, but his headquarters is a nondescript building at the corner of Dover Street where he's created what amounts to a human processing center. The ground floor looks like an ordinary tavern, complete with tables, chairs, and a bar stocked with liquor that's only slightly more poisonous than what most Fourth Ward establishments serve. But the real business happens in the back rooms and basement, where Haddon has constructed a system for efficiently capturing, processing, and delivering human cargo to his maritime clients. The process typically begins when a potential victim enters one of Haddon's establishments looking for a drink, a meal, or a place to spend the night. These are usually men who are new to the city, temporarily unemployed, or simply down on their luck. People who won't be missed if they disappear for a few months. Haddon's bartenders are trained to identify promising targets and begin the recruitment process immediately. They offer free drinks to men who appear to have money, engage them in friendly conversation to assess their background and connections, and gradually introduce them to other patrons who are actually Haddon's employees. The key to successful Shangyi is making the victim feel comfortable and secure before springing the trap. Haddon's people tell stories of job opportunities, of ships that need experienced workers, of captains who pay fair wages and treat their crews well. They create an atmosphere of camaraderie and opportunity that makes even suspicious men lower their guard. Once a target has been identified and softened up, the real work begins. Haddon personally mixes the drinks that will render victims unconscious, using a combination of chloral hydrate and alcohol that he's perfected through years of experimentation. The mixture is designed to knock a man out quickly but leave him functional enough to be moved without attracting attention. The timing has to be perfect. Too little chloral hydrate and the victim might fight back or escape. Too much, and he might die, which reduces his value to ship captains who need living crew members. Haddon has developed an almost supernatural ability to judge exactly how much drug each victim can handle based on their size, apparent alcohol tolerance, and general health. Once the drugs take effect, Haddon's assistants move quickly to remove the unconscious victim from the establishment and transport him to a secure holding area. This is done with practiced efficiency. Two men grab the victim under the arms and walk him toward the door as if he's simply too drunk to walk on his own. To casual observers, it looks like friends helping someone who's had too much to drink. The holding areas are another of Haddon's innovations. Rather than keeping drugged victims in obvious prisons, he's created spaces that look like legitimate boarding house rooms. Victims who regain consciousness find themselves in what appears to be a normal bedroom, with a concerned friend explaining that they passed out from drinking and were brought somewhere safe to sleep it off. This psychological manipulation is crucial to Haddon's success. Victims who believe they're safe are less likely to try to escape, and they're more susceptible to suggestions about signing up for voyages that their clouded minds might otherwise reject. Haddon's people are trained to present Shangyi as a legitimate employment opportunity, complete with contracts that victims sign while still under the influence of drugs. But not all victims are fooled, and Haddon has developed increasingly sophisticated methods for dealing with men who resist his recruitment effort. The basement of his headquarters contains a series of cells where uncooperative victims can be held until they either agree to sign up for voyages, or until their physical condition deteriorates enough that they'll accept any opportunity to escape their circumstance. These cells are deliberately designed to break down resistance through a combination of physical discomfort and psychological pressure. They're too small to stand up in but too narrow to lie down comfortably. There's no light, minimal ventilation, and just enough food and water to keep prisoners alive. The sound of rats and other vermin is constant, and the smell is indescribable. Men held in these conditions for even a few days typically emerge willing to agree to anything that will get them out of the cells. When Haddon's people offer them the opportunity to sign contracts for ocean voyages,
Most victims see it as their only chance of survival. The contracts themselves are masterpieces of legal deception, written in dense legal language that's difficult to understand even under ideal circumstances. They commit signers to voyages that can last years and include provisions that make it virtually impossible for crew members to leave their ships at foreign ports. The pay promised in the contracts is rarely delivered, and the working conditions are typically far worse than anything described in the document. Once contracts are signed, victims are transported to waiting ships through a network of tunnels and back alleys that Haddon has developed over years of operation. The routes are designed to avoid police patrols and areas where victims might be recognized by people who know that transportation typically happens at night, with unconscious or semi-conscious victims moved in carts or wagons that appear to be carrying legitimate cargo. The handoff to ship captains is handled with business-like efficiency. Haddon charges different rates depending on the victim's apparent physical condition, work experience, and resistance level. Healthy young men with sailing experience command premium prices, while older or less capable victims are sold at discount rates to captains who aren't particular about crew quality. Ship captains who do business with Haddon understand that their new crew members might be less than enthusiastic about their maritime careers, so they typically arrange to have ships depart immediately after receiving their human cargo. By the time victims fully regain consciousness and understand their situation, they're usually far enough from shore that escape is impossible. To make matters worse, maritime law in the 1860s heavily favors ship captains in disputes with crew members. Once a man has signed a contract and boarded a ship, he's legally bound to complete the voyage regardless of how he came to sign that contract. Courts rarely investigate allegations of shangying, and when they do, the legal system is stacked against victims who are typically poor, friendless, and unable to afford competent representation. Tommy Haddon has perfected this system to the point where he can guarantee delivery of specific numbers of crew members within days of receiving orders from ship captain. He maintains a network of informants who alert him to promising targets, a staff of skilled bartenders and con artists who can drug and manipulate victims, and a logistics operation that can move human cargo efficiently and discreetly. But Haddon's success depends on more than just operational efficiency. It requires the active cooperation of corrupt officials throughout New York's legal system. Police officers receive regular payments to avoid patrolling certain areas at certain times. Judges are compensated for dismissing cases that might expose shangying operations. Even city health inspectors are paid to overlook the unsanitary conditions in Haddon's holding facilities. This corruption extends far beyond simple bribery. Haddon has cultivated relationships with politicians, businessmen, and social leaders who benefit from the economic activity that shangying generates. Ship owners save money on crew recruitment costs. Port authorities collect taxes on vessels that might otherwise be unable to maintain their schedules. Even some reform organizations receive donations from people whose businesses depend on the availability of cheap maritime labor. The victims of shangying come from all walks of life, but they share certain characteristics that make them vulnerable to Haddon's techniques. Many are recent immigrants who don't understand American legal systems and have few connections to people who might help them. Others are men who've fallen on hard times and are desperate enough to take risks they might normally avoid. Perhaps most tragically, some victims are men who are genuinely looking for work at sea, but who lack the connections or resources to find legitimate employment opportunity. These men enter Haddon's establishments hoping to find honest work, only to discover that they've become commodities in a trade that treats human beings as disposable resources. The psychological impact on shangying victims is profound and lasting. Men who survive voyages often return to find that months or years have passed, that they've been given up for dead by their families, and that their former lives have disappeared. The trauma of forced maritime service, combined with the realization that they were sold like livestock, leaves many victims permanently damaged. Some never recover from the experience. They become part of the Fourth Ward's permanent population of broken men, drinking away memories they can't face and warning newcomers about the dangers that lurk behind every friendly face and free drink. Others become hardened by their experiences, adopting the same callous disregard for human welfare that characterized their captor. Some even join shangying operations themselves, reasoning that it's better to be the predator than the prey in a system that seems designed to destroy ordinary decency. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Tommy Haddon's operation is how normal it has become to the residents of Water Street. Shangying is discussed openly in saloons and boarding houses, with people sharing tips on how to avoid becoming victims and debating the relative merits of different Shangyisters. It's become simply another part of the neighborhood's economy, as accepted as prostitution or theft. This normalization of human trafficking reflects the broader dehumanization that pervades life in the Fourth Ward, in a place where survival often requires abandoning conventional morality, where the legal system protects the wealthy and powerful while abandoning the poor and vulnerable, and where economic desperation drives people to extremes that would horrify their former selves. Shangying seems almost inevitable. Tommy Haddon hasn't created this system, he's simply recognized it and found a way to profit from it. He's identified a market demand for human labor and developed efficient methods for supplying that demand. Regardless of the human cost involved, his success isn't a sign of exceptional criminal talent. It's a symptom of a society that has failed to protect its most vulnerable member. As you continue down Water Street, having somehow escaped Haddon's notice, you can't shake the feeling that you're being watched and evaluated by dozens of predators who see you not as a human being but as a potential commodity. Every friendly gesture, every offer of hospitality, every invitation to share a drink carries the possibility that you might be the next person to wake up in the hold of a ship bound for destinations you never chose to visit. But Tommy Haddon's operation, horrific as it is, represents only one form of human exploitation on Water Street. Just ahead you'll encounter criminals who have elevated violence to an art form and turned murder into a business model. The fog rolls in from the East River as evening approaches, and with it comes the sound you've learned to fear most on Water Street. The gentle lapping of oars cutting through dark water. Somewhere out there, moving like ghosts through the maze of anchored ships and piers, the river pirates are beginning their nightly hunt. You're standing on one of the rotting wharves that jut out into the East River from Water Street, watching as legitimate maritime traffic prepares for the night. Merchant vessels drop their anchors and post minimal watches, their captains trusting that proximity to the city will protect them from the dangers they faced on the open ocean. They have no idea that they've entered waters controlled by some of the most ruthless criminals in American history. The river pirates of New York Harbor aren't the romantic figures of Caribbean legend. These are organized criminals who have turned the waterfront into their personal kingdom, where ships are robbed with industrial efficiency, and human life is cheaper than the cargo being stolen. At the heart of this maritime criminal empire is Patsy Conroy, a name that strikes fear into the hearts of ship captains throughout New York Harbor. Conroy leads what police consider the most dangerous and successful river pirate gang in the city's history, an organization that operates with the precision of a military unit and the ruthlessness of a pack of wolves.
Patsy Conroy doesn't look like a pirate captain from the movies. He's a short, stocky Irish immigrant with scarred hands and the kind of face that blends into any crowd of working men. But beneath his unremarkable exterior lies a criminal mind that has revolutionized maritime theft and turned river piracy into a highly profitable business. Conroy's gang operates from a series of hidden bases along the East River waterfront, using abandoned buildings, concealed boat slips, and networks of tunnels that connect to establishments like Dallas Mag's Hole in the Wall. These bases serve as staging areas for raids, storage facilities for stolen goods, and safe houses where gang members can disappear when police pressure becomes too intense. The gang's boats are specially modified for their criminal purposes. From a distance, they look like ordinary workboats or fishing vessels, but closer inspection reveals modifications designed for stealth and speed. The oars are wrapped with cloth to muffle sound. The hulls are painted dark colors that blend into the nighttime water. Storage compartments are concealed throughout each vessel, allowing pirates to hide stolen goods or weapons during hasty escapes. But it's the gang's operational methods that truly set them apart from ordinary criminals. Conroy has developed a system of intelligence gathering that would impress modern organized crime bosses. His people work throughout the waterfront district as dock workers, tavern keepers, ship chandlers, and boarding house operators, gathering information about arriving vessels. their cargo, and their security arrangements. This intelligence network allows Conroy's gang to target specific ships carrying the most valuable cargo while avoiding vessels that might be too heavily guarded or too closely watched by authorities. They know which captains carry large amounts of cash, which ships are loaded with easily sold merchandise, and which vessels have minimal security arrangements. The planning for each raid is meticulous. Gang members scout their targets for days, learning the routines of the crew, identifying the best approach routes, and determining the optimal timing for their attacks. They study tide charts, weather patterns, and police patrol schedules to maximize their chances of success while minimizing the risk of capture. When the gang strikes, they do so with coordinated precision. Multiple boats approach the target vessel from different directions, making it impossible for the crew to focus their defensive efforts. The pirates board quickly and silently, overwhelming any resistance before victims can organize an effective response. But it's what happens next that reveals the true brutality of Conroy's operation. Unlike the romanticized pirates of popular fiction, these criminals show no mercy to their victims. Crew members who resist are beaten unconscious or thrown overboard. Those who cooperate are often killed anyway to prevent them from identifying their attackers. The gang has developed a reputation for leaving no witnesses, and that reputation serves as both a deterrent to resistance and a calling card that strikes terror into potential victims. The stolen cargo is processed through a network of fences and legitimate businesses that Conroy has cultivated throughout Manhattan. Valuable goods disappear into the city's commercial system within hours of being stolen, making recovery virtually impossible. Cash and jewelry are divided among gang members according to a complex hierarchy that reflects each member's contribution to the operation. But Conroy's gang doesn't limit itself to simple theft. They've branched out into kidnapping, targeting wealthy passengers on luxury vessels and holding them for ransom. These operations require different skills and resources, but they offer the potential for much larger profits than ordinary cargo theft. The kidnapping process is almost surgical in its precision. Gang members board target vessels posing as passengers or crew members, then identify and isolate victims when the ships are far enough from shore that escape is impossible. The victims are transferred to the pirates' boats and taken to secure locations where they're held until their families pay the demanded ransoms. The psychological torture inflicted on kidnapping victims is designed to break down their resistance and encourage quick payment of ransom. Victims are held in dark, cramped spaces aboard the pirates' vessels, fed minimal amounts of rotten food, and subjected to constant threats of violence. Many are forced to write letters to their families describing their treatment in graphic detail to encourage prompt payment. Some victims are never returned, even after ransoms are paid. Conroy's gang has discovered that wealthy families will sometimes pay multiple ransoms for the same victim, believing that additional payments will ensure their loved one's safe return. This cruel deception has generated enormous profits while destroying dozens of families who exhaust their resources trying to save relatives who have already been murdered. The gang's success has attracted imitators and competitors, leading to violent territorial wars that have turned the East River into a battleground. The Hook Gang, based near Corlear's Hook, challenges Conroy's dominance in the northern part of the harbor. The Charlton Street Gang operates along the Hudson River. Smaller organizations fight for control of specific piers or shipping routes. These conflicts aren't just business disputes. They're wars fought with guns, knives, and explosives that endanger everyone who works or lives near the waterfront. Rival gangs sabotage each other's boats, assassinate each other's leaders, and engage in running battles that sometimes spill over into the streets of the Fourth Ward. The Hook Gang, led by James Coffey and Tommy Shea, has developed its own distinctive methods that complement and compete with Conroy's techniques. Where Conroy's gang relies on stealth and precision, the Hook Gang employs brazen daylight attacks that terrorize victims through sheer audacity. One of their most notorious raids involved forcing an 8-man rowing club to row their boat to the Brooklyn shore at gunpoint, then ordering the rowers to jump overboard and swim to safety while Coffey and Shea escaped with the boat. The psychological impact of this attack, turning a recreational activity into a life-threatening ordeal, sent shockwaves through New York's maritime community. The Hook Gang's leader, James Coffey, has become legendary for his willingness to kill without provocation or warning. Unlike Conroy, who maintains at least the pretense of business efficiency, Coffey seems to genuinely enjoy inflicting pain and terror on his victim. He's been known to torture crew members for information about hidden valuables, to force captives to fight each other for his amusement, and to kill victims in elaborately cruel ways that serve no practical purpose. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the river pirate problem is how it reflects the broader breakdown of law and order in New York Harbor. The city's police force is landlubbers who have neither the boats nor the expertise to pursue criminals on the water. The federal authorities who might have jurisdiction over maritime crimes are understaffed and focused on larger issues like the ongoing Civil War. This law enforcement vacuum has allowed the river pirates to operate with virtual impunity. They attack ships within sight of Manhattan's shore, conduct their business openly in waterfront establishments, and recruit new members from the desperate population of the Fourth Ward. The legitimate maritime industry has learned to accept piracy as simply another cost of doing business in New York Harbor. Ship owners hire private guards, but these men are often outgunned and outnumbered by well-organized pirate gangs. Insurance companies raise their rates to cover losses from piracy, but this only makes legitimate commerce more expensive while doing nothing to address the underlying problem. Some captains attempt to negotiate safe passage agreements with pirate leaders, essentially paying tribute for the right to conduct business in waters that should be protected by law. The human cost of river piracy extends far beyond the immediate victims of raid. Families of murdered crew members receive no compensation and often no information about what happened to their loved ones. The economic impact ripples through the entire maritime industry, making New York Harbor a more dangerous and expensive place to do business. Perhaps most tragically, the success of the river pirates has created a cycle of violence that perpetuates itself across generations. Young men growing up in the Fourth Ward see piracy as one of the few paths to economic success available to them. They're recruited into gangs as children, trained in violence from an early age, and gradually hardened into the kind of criminals who can board a ship and murder its entire crew without feeling remorse. The boats used by these young recruits are often stolen from legitimate fishermen or maritime workers, adding another layer of victimization to the piracy problem. A man who loses his boat to pirates might lose his livelihood, forcing him to find other ways to survive, sometimes including joining the criminal enterprises that destroyed his previous life. The river pirates have also corrupted legitimate maritime businesses through a combination of intimidation and economic incentives. Dock workers provide information about valuable cargoes in exchange for shares of stolen goods. Ship chandlers sell supplies to pirates while maintaining their legitimate businesses. Even some ship captains engage in insurance fraud by cooperating with staged pirate attacks on their own vessels. This web of corruption makes it virtually impossible for honest maritime workers to avoid becoming entangled in criminal activity. Men who refuse to cooperate with pirates often find themselves unable to work in the harbor, while those who do cooperate become complicit in crimes that grow increasingly violent and destructive. The psychological impact on the entire waterfront community is profound. Children grow up assuming that violence and lawlessness are normal parts of life. Workers develop the kind of hypervigilance that comes from constantly expecting attack. Families live with the knowledge that their breadwinners might not return from work any given day. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the river pirate phenomenon is how it reveals the complete failure of governmental institutions to protect the people they're supposed to serve. The pirates operate openly, their identities are widely known, and their crimes are documented in newspaper accounts that describe their activities in detail. Yet they continue to operate year after year, growing bolder and more violent as they realize that no effective opposition exists. This failure of governance has created a situation where criminals like Patsy Conroy wield more real power in their territories than elected officials or law enforcement officers. They tax legitimate businesses through protection rackets, resolve disputes through violence, and maintain order through fear. In effect, they've created parallel governments that operate according to their own rules and serve their own interests. The river pirates aren't just criminals, they're symptoms of a social and political system that has abandoned entire communities to fend for themselves.
In neighborhoods like the Fourth Ward, where government services barely exist and economic opportunities are virtually non-existent, criminal organizations inevitably step in to fill the vacuum left by legitimate institutions. As you stand on the wharf watching the dark shapes of pirate boats moving through the harbor, you're witnessing more than just maritime crime. You're seeing the result of what happens when a society creates conditions of such desperation that people will do anything to survive, even if it means preying on their neighbors and destroying the community they claim to be protecting. The fog grows thicker as the night deepens, and somewhere in that gray obscurity, men are dying for cargo that will be sold and forgotten within days. Their names will never appear in any official records. Their families will never learn what happened to them. They'll simply vanish into the dark waters of the East River, becoming part of the uncounted cost of doing business in Manhattan's most dangerous neighborhood. But even the river pirates pale in comparison to the next group of criminals you'll encounter as you continue down Water Street, because some of the Fourth Ward's residents have discovered that there are things even more profitable than stealing from ships. You're walking down a narrow alley between two crumbling tenements when you hear something that makes your blood run cold. The sound of a manhole cover being lifted from below. Before you can react, hands emerge from the darkness of the sewer system, grabbing at your ankles and trying to drag you down into the fetid tunnels that run beneath the Fourth Ward like the arteries of some diseased organism. Welcome to the domain of the Swamp Angels, the most feared criminal gang in New York City, and possibly the most disturbing group of human beings ever to call Manhattan home. The Swamp Angels aren't just another street gang. They've taken the concept of urban predation to its logical extreme by literally going underground, creating a criminal empire in the maze of sewers, abandoned tunnels, and forgotten cellars that lies beneath the Fourth Ward. They emerge from manholes and storm drains like creatures from a nightmare, strike with surgical precision, then disappear back into their subterranean kingdom before their victims can even understand what's happened to them. The gang's origin story reads like something from a horror novel, but every word of it is documented in police reports and newspaper accounts from when the city began expanding its sewer system in the 1850s, the construction left behind a network of abandoned tunnels, partially completed passages, and forgotten maintenance areas that honeycombed the ground beneath lower Manhattan. These tunnels were supposed to be sealed off and forgotten, but the desperate residents of the Fourth Ward quickly discovered that they could be used for purposes that the city engineers never intended. First, they became hiding places for stolen goods. Then they became escape routes for criminals fleeing police pursuit. Eventually, they became permanent homes for people who had been pushed beyond the margins of even the Fourth Ward's minimal standards of civilization. The Swamp Angels began as a loose association of men who lived in these tunnels, emerging at night to scavenge, steal, and beg. But under the leadership of a man known only as Saul the Resurrectionist, they evolved into something far more sinister. A highly organized criminal army that treats the entire above-ground world as their hunting ground. Saul the Resurrectionist earned his nickname through his previous profession as a body snatcher, stealing corpses from graveyards and selling them to medical schools for anatomical study. But he discovered that living bodies were far more profitable than dead ones, and he gradually shifted his focus from grave robbing to kidnapping, murder, and theft on a scale that dwarfed the activities of surface gangs.
The Swamp Angels' underground headquarters occupies a section of abandoned sewer tunnel that extends for nearly a mile beneath the Fourth Ward. They've modified these tunnels extensively, creating living spaces, storage areas, meeting rooms, and torture chambers that would horrify even the most hardened criminals working above ground. The living conditions in these tunnels are indescribable. The air is thick with the stench of human waste, rotting food, and decomposing bodies. Water seeps constantly through the walls, creating a layer of slime that coats every surface. Rats are so numerous that they've lost all fear of humans, and many Swamp Angels bear scars from rat bites that became infected in the unsanitary conditions. But the physical environment is nothing compared to the psychological atmosphere that pervades the Swamp Angels' domain. Living in perpetual darkness, surrounded by filth and death, cut off from normal human contact, the gang members have developed a culture that abandons all pretense of civilized behavior. They communicate in grunts and whispers. They eat whatever they can scavenge or steal, and they treat violence as the natural solution to every problem. The gang's recruitment process reflects this complete abandonment of normal human values. New members aren't recruited, they're captured. The Swamp Angels prowl the streets above, looking for individuals who won't be missed. Recent immigrants, homeless men, prostitutes past their prime, and anyone else who exists on the margins of Fourth Ward society. These victims are dragged down into the tunnels, where they're subjected to a process that can only be described as systematic dehumanization. They're stripped of their possessions, their identities, and eventually their sanity. Those who adapt to tunnel life become gang members. Those who don't simply disappear. The transformation from normal human being to Swamp Angel is documented in police reports that read like case studies in psychological destruction. Men who enter the tunnels as recognizable individuals emerge weeks or months later as creatures that barely qualify as human. They've lost the ability to speak normally, they can't tolerate sunlight, and they react to other people with the kind of feral hostility that you'd expect from wild animals. But it's the gang's operational methods that truly set them apart from other criminal organizations. Where surface gangs operate in territories that can be mapped and understood, the Swamp Angels can appear anywhere in the Fourth Ward without warning. They emerge from manholes in the middle of busy streets. They climb out of storm drains during rainstorms, and they break through basement floors of buildings whose owners had no idea that tunnels ran beneath their foundation. Their signature crime is what police reports describe as sewer ambushes. Gang members position themselves in storm drains and sewer openings, waiting for victims to pass overhead. When a suitable target appears, someone walking alone, carrying visible valuables, or simply looking vulnerable, the Swamp Angels strike with coordinated precision. The victim is grabbed and dragged underground before they can cry for help. By the time witnesses realize what's happened, the street appears normal again, with no sign that a human being has just vanished into the earth. The only evidence might be a few puffs of blood near a manhole cover, and even that typically washes away during the next rainstorm. What happens to these victims in the tunnels varies depending on their apparent value to the gang. Wealthy individuals are held for ransom, though the ransom demands are often delivered in ways that terrorize the victims' families almost as much as the kidnapping itself. The Swamp Angels have been known to leave severed fingers or ears on doorsteps, along with notes written in what appears to be blood demanding payment for the victim's safe return. But many victims are never intended to be returned. The Swamp Angels have discovered that there are markets for human beings that most people prefer not to think about. Some victims are sold to ship captains who don't ask questions about their crew's background. Others disappear into illegal medical experiments conducted by physicians who need test subjects for procedures that no ethical doctor would attempt on willing patients. The most disturbing victims are those who are kept in the tunnels indefinitely, either as slaves who perform menial labor for the gang, or as entertainment for members who have developed tastes that defy description. Police reports from raids on Swamp Angel territories describe discovering people who had been held underground for months or years, their minds broken by prolonged exposure to conditions that would drive anyone insane. The gang's relationship with the legitimate world above ground is complex and terrifying. On one level, they're completely separate from normal society, living in a realm that most people don't even know exists. But on another level, they're intimately connected to the Fourth Ward's economy through their criminal activities and their network of above-ground collaborators. Many surface criminals work with the Swamp Angels, providing information about potential victims in exchange for shares of stolen goods. Corrupt city workers help the gang access new tunnel systems and warn them about planned sewer maintenance that might disrupt their operation. Even some legitimate businessmen have been known to hire the Swamp Angels for jobs that require people to disappear permanently and discreetly. This collaboration between surface and underground criminals has created a criminal ecosystem that's virtually impossible for law enforcement to combat effectively. Police raids on known Swamp Angel territories typically find nothing but empty tunnels and evidence of recent habitation. The gang members simply retreat deeper into the tunnel system, wait for the authorities to leave,
then return to resume their activity. The few successful raids on Swamp Angel strongholds have revealed conditions that shocked even veteran police officers who thought they'd seen everything the Fourth Ward had to offer. Crime scenes include torture chambers equipped with devices that appear to have been designed specifically for inflicting maximum pain, storage areas filled with human remains in various stages of decomposition, living spaces that suggest their occupants have abandoned any connection to normal human behavior. But perhaps the most disturbing discoveries are the children found in these underground layers. Some are kidnapping victims, but others appear to have been born in the tunnels and raised by the gang as a new generation of Swamp Angel. These children have never seen sunlight, have never learned to speak properly, and react to rescue attempts with the kind of terror that suggests they've been conditioned to view the outside world as more dangerous than their underground prison. The psychological impact of the Swamp Angels extends far beyond their immediate victims. The knowledge that predators can emerge from beneath the streets at any moment has transformed the way people move through the Fourth Ward. Residents avoid walking alone, especially at night. They stay away from areas near manholes or storm drains. Children are warned never to venture into cellars or any spaces that might connect to the tunnel system. But these precautions provide only limited protection against criminals who can strike from directions that victims never expect. The Swamp Angels have been known to break through basement floors, emerge from abandoned wells, and even climb up through privies to attack victims in what should be private, secure spaces. The gang's impact on the Fourth Ward's already fragile social fabric is profound and destructive. The constant fear of underground attack has made residents even more suspicious of each other, since anyone could potentially be a Swamp Angel collaborator. Neighborhood cooperation, which is essential for survival in such a harsh environment, becomes virtually impossible when people can't trust their neighbors. The economic impact is equally severe. Businesses lose customers who are afraid to venture out after dark. Property values plummet as word spreads about Swamp Angel activity in specific areas. Even legitimate construction projects are delayed or abandoned when workers refuse to work in locations where they might encounter tunnel systems. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Swamp Angels phenomenon is how it represents the ultimate logical conclusion of the social abandonment that characterizes life in the Fourth Ward. These aren't people who chose to become monsters. They're human beings who were pushed so far beyond the margins of civilized society that they developed their own horrific version of civilization in the spaces that the rest of the world had forgotten. The tunnels beneath the Fourth Ward aren't just hiding places for criminals. They're symbols of everything that's wrong with a society that creates conditions so desperate that people will literally go underground rather than continue trying to survive in the world above. The Swamp Angels are what happens when human beings are systematically dehumanized by circumstances beyond their control, then left to create their own communities according to principles that have nothing to do with conventional morality. As you continue walking down Water Street, every manhole cover you pass seems to represent a potential portal to hell. Every storm drain might conceal eyes watching and evaluating you as a potential victim. Every basement entrance could connect to tunnels where human screams echo through darkness that never ends. But even the Swamp Angels, horrific as they are, represent only one form of predation in the Fourth Ward's ecosystem of violence and exploitation. Because some of the neighborhood's criminals have discovered that the most profitable crimes don't require going underground at all. They just require abandoning the last remnants of human decency. You notice her before she notices you. A woman standing in a doorway along Water Street, her dress once fine but now patched and faded, her face painted with cosmetics that can't quite hide the bruises underneath. She's young, maybe 20, but her eyes hold the kind of exhaustion that comes from seeing too much of humanity's worst impulses. When she approaches you with a forced smile and a proposition delivered in a voice trying too hard to sound cheerful, you realize you're encountering one of the Fourth Ward's most tragic figures. A woman trying to survive in a place designed to destroy everything feminine and decent. This is the reality for hundreds of women who call Water Street home in the 1860s. not by choice but because circumstances have left them with no other option. In a neighborhood where men struggle to survive through violence and crime, women face additional challenges that push many of them toward forms of exploitation that would be unthinkable in more civilized areas of Manhattan. The women of Water Street come from diverse backgrounds, but they share common stories of abandonment, abuse, and economic desperation. Some are recent immigrants whose husbands died during ocean crossings or shortly after arrival in New York. Others are wives and daughters of men who disappeared into the Fourth Ward's criminal underworld, leaving their families with no means of support. Many are refugees from domestic violence who fled abusive situations only to discover that life on the streets offered different but equally dangerous forms of brutalization. Some are former domestic servants who lost their positions due to economic downturns or false accusations, finding themselves blacklisted from respectable employment and forced to accept whatever work they could find. But regardless of how they arrived on Water Street, these women quickly discover that their survival depends on navigating a social and economic system that views them as commodities rather than human beings. The neighborhood's economy offers few legitimate opportunities for female employment, and those that exist typically pay wages that are insufficient for survival in even the Fourth Ward's squalid condition. The most common form of employment available to women is prostitution, but the reality of this work in the Fourth Ward bears no resemblance to romanticized depictions of fallen women with hearts of gold. The women working Water Street's brothels and streets are trapped in a system of exploitation that combines the worst aspects of slavery, indentured servitude, and predatory capitalism. Most of these women work for madams like Hellcat Maggie O'Brien, who runs a network of brothels and street operations throughout the Fourth Ward. Maggie earned her nickname through her practice of filing her teeth to sharp points and wearing brass fingernails that she uses to disfigure clients who don't pay or women who try to leave her employ. She's built an empire based on the systematic brutalization of women who have nowhere else to turn. The women who work for Hellcat Maggie typically surrender 60 to 70% of their earnings in exchange for room, board, and protection, though the protection is often more theoretical than real. They live in rooms that are barely large enough for a bed, sharing space with rats, bed bugs, and whatever diseases their clients might carry. Medical care is non-existent, and women who become too sick or injured to work are simply turned out onto the streets to die. But prostitution is just one form of exploitation that women face on Water Street. Many work in the neighborhood's numerous saloons and dance halls, where their primary job is to encourage customers to drink as much as possible while providing entertainment that ranges from dancing to more intimate service. These women typically work for tips and a small percentage of the drinks they sell, but the real money comes from pickpocketing intoxicated customers and steering them toward illegal gambling operations. The dance halls themselves are temples to masculine fantasies of dominance and control. Women are expected to dance with anyone who pays, accept whatever physical contact their partners demand, and smile through treatment that would be considered assault in any other context. Many of these establishments feature basement rooms where more private services are available, and women who work there understand that their continued employment depends on their willingness to satisfy whatever desires their customers might express. Some women find employment in the Fourth Ward's numerous boarding houses, where they cook, clean, and provide personal services for the transient male population that flows through the neighborhood. These jobs might seem more respectable than prostitution, but they often involve similar forms of sexual exploitation, as boarding house operators expect their female employees to provide comprehensive entertainment for their guests. The women who work in boarding houses typically live in conditions that are even worse than those endured by the male residents. They sleep in basements or attics, work 18-hour days without breaks, and face constant threats of sexual violence from both customers and their employer. Many supplement their meager wages through theft, picking the pockets of sleeping boarders or stealing small items that can be sold to fences throughout the neighborhood. But perhaps the most heartbreaking group of women on Water Street are those who have children. Motherhood in the Fourth Ward is a special kind of hell, as women struggle to protect their offspring in an environment where childhood innocence is a luxury that few families can
afford. Children are exposed to violence, prostitution, and criminal activity from infancy, and many learn to contribute to their family's survival through begging, theft, or worse. Mothers in the Fourth Ward face impossible choices on a daily basis. They can try to shield their children from the neighborhood's worst influences, but this often means keeping them locked in cramped, unhealthy rooms where they might sicken and die from diseases caused by poor sanitation and malnutrition. Alternatively, they can allow their children to roam the streets where they'll learn survival skills but will also be exposed to trauma that will mark them for life. Many women are forced to choose between feeding their children and maintaining any pretense of respectability. Mothers have been known to sell their bodies to buy food for starving children, reasoning that temporary moral compromise is preferable to watching their offspring die of hunger. Others send their children to work in dangerous factories or criminal enterprises, knowing that the wages might mean the difference between survival and death for the entire family. The psychological toll of motherhood in the Fourth Ward is documented in the journals and letters of social workers who ventured into the neighborhood during reform efforts in the late 80s. They describe women who have been so brutalized by their circumstances that they've lost the ability to show affection toward their own children, treating them with the same emotional distance they've learned to maintain toward customers and employers who view them as disposable objects. Some women respond to the Fourth Ward's brutal conditions by adopting the same callous attitudes toward human suffering that characterize the neighborhood's male criminals. These women become predators themselves, operating confidence games, managing criminal enterprises, and sometimes engaging in violence that rivals anything their male counterparts produce. Sadie the Goat Farrell represents perhaps the most extreme example of this transformation. Sadie began as a typical Fourth Ward prostitute, working the streets and bars around Water Street, but she gradually evolved into something far more dangerous. She became the leader of a river pirate gang that terrorized shipping throughout New York Harbor, earning her nickname through her practice of headbutting opponents before robbing them. Sadie's gang operated a stolen sloop that flew the Jolly Roger flag, attacking merchant vessels and kidnapping wealthy passengers for ransom. Under her leadership, the gang became one of the most successful criminal enterprises operating in New York waters, generating profits that allowed Sadie to live more comfortably than most legitimate businessmen. But Sadie's success came at a cost that went beyond the immediate victims of her crimes. Her transformation from exploited woman to violent predator represents the complete corruption of maternal instincts and feminine compassion by an environment that punishes decency and rewards brutality. The Fourth Ward didn't just destroy Sadie's respectability, it turned her into a monster who preyed on the same kind of vulnerable people she had once been. Other women find different ways to survive the Fourth Ward's harsh realities. Some become informants for police or rival gangs, selling information about criminal activities in exchange for protection or small payments. These women occupy a dangerous middle ground between legitimate society and the criminal underworld, never fully trusted by either side but valuable enough to both that they can sometimes carve out a precarious form of security. A few women manage to establish legitimate businesses in the Fourth Ward, typically small shops that serve the neighborhood's basic needs. But even these enterprises typically depend on criminal connections for protection, and many female business owners are forced to allow their establishments to be used for illegal activities in exchange for being left alone by the gangs that control their territory. The most successful women entrepreneurs in the Fourth Ward are those who embrace the neighborhood's criminal economy, rather than fighting against it. They open brothels, run illegal gambling operations, or establish fencing networks that help dispose of stolen goods. These women often become wealthy and powerful within the Fourth Ward's social hierarchy, but their success requires them to abandon conventional morality and participate in the systematic exploitation of other women. The relationship between the women of Water Street and the neighborhood's male criminal population is complex and often contradictory. On one level, women are clearly victims of a system that treats them as property to be bought, sold and disposed of according to the whims of men who hold economic and physical power over them. But on another level, many women develop genuine relationships with male criminals, forming partnerships that provide mutual protection and support in an environment where survival often depends on having reliable allies. These relationships might begin as business arrangements, but they sometimes evolve into something resembling love, though it's love shaped by circumstances that would be unimaginable to people living in more stable community. The most tragic aspect of women's lives on Water Street might be how their experiences destroy their ability to form normal human connection. Women who have been systematically brutalized and exploited often lose the capacity for trust, affection, and emotional intimacy that are essential for healthy relationships. They learn to view all human interactions through the lens of exploitation, assuming that everyone they meet is trying to use them for some purpose. This emotional damage extends across generations, as mothers who have been brutalized often struggle to provide their children with the nurturing and protection that normal family relationships require. Children growing up in these circumstances learn to view violence and exploitation as normal parts of human relationships, perpetuating cycles of abuse that continue long after individuals manage to escape the Fourth Ward itself. The few women who do manage to escape Water Street often find that their experiences there have marked them in ways that make integration into respectable society nearly impossible. Former prostitutes discover that their past makes them unmarriageable to respectable men. Women who learn survival skills in the Fourth Ward find that those same skills make them unemployable in legitimate businesses. Even those who manage to establish new lives elsewhere carry psychological scars that affect their behavior for the rest of their lives. Perhaps the most heartbreaking stories are those of women who almost escape the Fourth Ward but are pulled back by circumstances beyond their control. A domestic servant who saves enough money to move to a better neighborhood might lose everything when her employer falsely accuses her of theft. A woman who finds legitimate work might be forced to return to prostitution when she becomes pregnant and loses her job. A mother who manages to get her children into a decent school might have to pull them out when she can no longer afford the fee. These near misses with respectability highlight how the Fourth Ward functions as a trap designed to prevent people from improving their circumstances. The neighborhood's economy depends on having a steady supply of desperate people willing to work for minimal wages under horrible conditions. Women who show signs of escaping these circumstances often find themselves the targets of systematic campaigns designed to drag them back down to the level where they can be exploited most effectively. But even in this environment of systematic dehumanization, some women manage to maintain their dignity and humanity. They form mutual support networks, sharing resources and information that help each other survive. They protect each other's children when possible, creating surrogate family structures that provide some measure of stability in an otherwise chaotic environment. These women often become the neighborhood's informal social workers, helping newcomers navigate the Fourth Ward's dangers and providing emotional support for those who are struggling with the psychological impacts of their circumstance. They maintain small acts of kindness and compassion that serve as reminders that human decency can survive even in the most brutal environment. The presence of these women and their determination to preserve some measure of humanity despite everything they've endured provides perhaps the only hope that exists in the Fourth Ward's otherwise bleak landscape. They demonstrate that even when society abandons people to circumstances that seem designed to destroy everything good about human nature, some individuals can still choose compassion over cruelty and cooperation over exploitation. As you continue walking down Water Street, you begin to understand that the women you encounter aren't just victims or survivors, they're the Fourth Ward's last repository of human decency. In a neighborhood where violence and greed have become the primary currencies of daily life,
These women often represent the final barrier between civilization and complete moral collapse. But even their resilience has limits, and the forces arrayed against them are growing stronger and more systematic. Because the Fourth Ward's criminal economy is evolving, becoming more organized and more efficient at destroying the human connections that make survival possible for its most vulnerable residents. You're standing outside a nondescript building on Water Street, and from the outside it looks like any other of the neighborhood's countless tenements. But the steady stream of well-dressed men entering and leaving, the discreet chalk marks on the door frame, and the careful positioning of lookouts on nearby corners tell a different story. This isn't just another flophouse or boarding house. This is the headquarters of one of New York's most sophisticated criminal enterprises, a business that has turned vice into a science and corruption into an art form. Welcome to the world of organized crime, Fourth Ward style, where the chaotic violence and random brutality you've witnessed throughout the neighborhood has been refined into systematic exploitation that generates profits rivaling those of legitimate corporations. The man behind this particular operation is Moses Mose Humphrey, though most people in the Fourth Ward know him simply as the Commodore, a title that reflects both his former maritime career and his current status as one of the neighborhood's most successful criminal entrepreneurs. Mose has taken the disorganized vice that characterizes most of Water Street and transformed it into a vertically integrated business empire that controls everything from street-level prostitution to high-level political corruption. The Commodore doesn't look like a typical Fourth Ward criminal. He's well-dressed, well-spoken, and maintains the kind of respectable appearance that allows him to move freely between the underworld and legitimate society. But beneath his civilized exterior lies a criminal mind that has revolutionized the way vice operates in New York City. Mose's empire begins with the building you're standing in front of, a 4-story structure that serves as both his headquarters and a showcase for the possibilities of organized crime. The ground floor operates as a legitimate saloon, serving customers who have no idea that they're in the nerve center of a criminal network that extends throughout Manhattan. But the real business happens on the upper floors, which house what Mose calls his entertainment facility. These aren't the crude brothels and gambling dens that characterize most Fourth Ward vice operations. They're sophisticated establishments that cater to wealthy customers who demand higher levels of service and discretion than street-level operations can provide. The second floor features private gambling rooms where politicians, businessmen, and other members of New York's elite can place bets without being seen by the general public. The games offered here aren't the simple card games and dice rolls found in ordinary saloons. They're complex operations involving stock manipulation, political outcomes, and business deals that allow customers to bet on information they've obtained through their professional position. The third floor houses Mose's most profitable operation, a high-end brothel that serves customers who are willing to pay premium prices for services that go far beyond simple prostitution. The women who work here aren't the desperate street prostitutes found elsewhere in the Fourth Ward. They're carefully selected and trained performers who understand that their job is to provide entertainment, companionship, and discretion to men whose positions in society require absolute confidentiality. But it's the fourth floor that reveals the true sophistication of Mose's operation. This level serves as his business office, complete with accounting ledgers, correspondence files, and detailed records of all his enterprises. Mose runs his criminal empire with the same attention to detail and long-term planning that characterizes successful legitimate businesses. The ledgers document a level of organization that would impress corporate accountants. Income is tracked by source with separate columns for gambling profits, prostitution revenues, extortion payments, and political expenses are categorized by type, including payroll for employees, protection payments to police and politicians, and investment in new criminal ventures. But perhaps most impressive is Mose's approach to human resources management. Unlike other Fourth Ward criminals who treat their employees as disposable assets, Mose developed a system that encourages loyalty and long-term commitment from his staff. He provides health care for injured workers, pension plans for long-serving employees, and even educational opportunities for promising young criminals who show potential for advancement within his organization. This enlightened approach to criminal employment has allowed Mose to attract and retain the most talented criminals in the Fourth Ward, His gambling operations are run by mathematicians who understand probability theory. His prostitution businesses are managed by women who have genuine business skills. His enforcement arm consists of men who can use violence strategically rather than randomly. The result is a criminal enterprise that operates with efficiency and profitability that far exceeds anything achieved by the neighborhood's traditional gangs and individual operators. Moses' businesses generate steady income streams that allow him to invest in expansion, political influence, and legitimate enterprises that provide cover for his illegal activities. But Moses' greatest innovation is his approach to political corruption. Rather than simply bribing individual officers or judges when problems arise, he's developed systematic relationships with politicians at every level of New York's government. These aren't simple pay-for-play arrangements, they're complex partnerships that benefit both Moses' criminal enterprises and his political allies' legitimate career. The system works through a network of intermediaries who handle the details of corruption while maintaining plausible deniability for everyone involved. A businessman who needs a city contract might approach one of Moses' associates for help. Money changes hands.
Pressure is applied in the right places and the contract is awarded. The politician receives a significant campaign contribution from a source that appears completely legitimate, while Moses takes a percentage of the contract value as his fee for facilitating the arrangement. This approach to corruption has made Moses one of the most powerful men in New York City, despite his complete lack of official position or legitimate authority. Politicians seek his support for their campaigns. Businessmen need his approval for their projects. Even law enforcement officials understand that their careers depend on maintaining good relationships with the Commodore. But Moses' influence extends far beyond simple political corruption. He's become a key figure in New York's legitimate economy through his investments in shipping, real estate, and manufacturing. These investments provide legal sources of income that help explain his obvious wealth, while also giving him influence over legitimate businesses that can be used to further his criminal enterprises. The shipping investments are particularly valuable as they provide cover for smuggling operations and give Moses advance information about valuable cargoes that might be targeted by his associates in the river pirate gangs. The real estate holdings allow him to control buildings throughout the Fourth Ward, providing secure locations for criminal activities while generating rental income from legitimate tenants. The manufacturing investments serve multiple purposes. They provide employment for criminals who need legitimate jobs to satisfy parole requirements or maintain respectable appearances. They produce goods that can be used in Moses' illegal enterprise, and they give him influence over labor unions and trade associations that can be used to pressure competitors or political opponents. But perhaps Moses' most impressive achievement is the way he's managed to insulate himself from the violence and chaos that characterizes most Fourth Ward criminal operations. While gangs like the Swamp Angels and River Pirates operate through intimidation and brutality, Moses' organization relies on professionalism and business discipline. Violence is used in Moses' empire, but it's applied strategically and proportionally. Employees who steal from the organization or betray its secrets are punished, but the punishments are designed to serve as examples rather than expressions of rage. Competitors who threaten Moses' businesses are eliminated, but the eliminations are carried out efficiently and discreetly. This controlled approach to violence has allowed Moses to avoid the attention that law enforcement typically focuses on more chaotic criminal organizations. Police investigations tend to concentrate on crimes that generate public outrage. Brutal murders, random attacks on civilians, or activities that threaten respectable neighborhoods. Moses' organization avoids these attention-grabbing activities, focusing instead on crimes that generate steady profits, without disturbing the peace of areas where influential people live and work. The sophistication of Moses' operation has attracted imitators throughout the Fourth Ward and beyond. Other criminal entrepreneurs have adopted his business methods, creating a new class of organized criminals who operate more like corporate executives than traditional street gangs. These new criminal organizations have formed alliances and business partnerships that span multiple neighborhoods and even extend to other cities. They share information, coordinate activities, and sometimes pool resources for large-scale operations that no single gang could attempt. But they've also created new forms of competition that are far more sophisticated than the territorial wars that characterize traditional gang conflicts. Instead of fighting over street corners, these organized criminals compete for political influence, business opportunities, and access to corrupted officials. The weapons in these conflicts are lawyers, accountants, and political operatives rather than knives and guns. The emergence of organized crime has fundamentally changed the character of vice in the Fourth Ward. What was once a chaotic collection of individual criminals and small gangs has evolved into a network of interconnected businesses that operate according to rational economic principles. This evolution has had mixed effects on the neighborhood's residents. On one hand, organized crime has reduced some forms of random violence, as criminal organizations prefer stable environments that allow them to conduct business without interference. Customers are more likely to visit gambling establishments and brothels if they feel reasonably safe from robbery or assault. On the other hand, organized crime has made vice more systematic and pervasive. Professional criminal organizations are more efficient at identifying and exploiting vulnerable people than individual operators. They have more resources to invest in recruiting new victims and maintaining operations even when law enforcement pressure increases. The women who work in Moses brothels, for example, experience different forms of exploitation than those working for traditional pimps. They're better fed, better housed, and better protected from violent customers, but they're also more completely controlled, with their movements monitored, their earnings carefully tracked, and their personal relationships managed by the organization. Similarly, the men who gamble in Moses establishments face more sophisticated forms of manipulation than those found in street-level operations. The games are designed to extract maximum profits from customers while maintaining the illusion that skilled players can win consistently. The psychological techniques used to encourage continued gambling are more advanced, and the methods for dealing with customers who can't pay their debts are more systematic. But perhaps the most significant impact of organized crime is the way it has corrupted legitimate institutions throughout New York City. The systematic bribery and political manipulation that allows criminal organizations to operate has created a culture of corruption that extends far beyond the Fourth Ward. Police officers learn that their advancement depends more on their relationships with criminal organizations than on their effectiveness at fighting crime. Judges understand that their reappointment relies on maintaining good relationships with people like Moses. Politicians discover that their campaigns require funding and support from sources that don't always bear close examination. This institutional corruption has created a feedback loop that makes criminal organizations stronger and more entrenched over time. As legitimate institutions become more corrupt, they become less effective at combating organized crime. As organized crime becomes more powerful, it gains more influence over legitimate institutions. The result is a system where the distinction between legal and illegal activities becomes increasingly blurred. Businessmen who wouldn't dream of committing street crimes find themselves participating in schemes that involve bribery, fraud, and conspiracy. Politicians who campaign on reform platforms discover that governing effectively requires compromising with criminal organizations. Even ordinary citizens find themselves complicit in the system, as they learn that getting things done in New York often requires working through networks that include criminal elements. A merchant who needs a permit might have to pay bribes that ultimately benefit organized crime. A family trying to get a sick relative into a hospital might have to use connections that involve criminal organizations. This normalization of corruption has profound implications for the moral character of the entire city. When criminal behavior becomes a necessary part of ordinary business and political activity, the ethical boundaries that separate civilization from chaos begin to dissolve. The Fourth Ward, which began as a place where desperate people were abandoned to fend for themselves, has evolved into something far more dangerous:
a laboratory for the systematic corruption of democratic institutions and free market capitalism. The criminal innovations developed in places like Mose Humphrey's headquarters are spreading throughout New York and beyond, creating new forms of organized crime that will plague American society for generations. As you walk away from the Commodore's building, you begin to understand that what you've witnessed isn't just local crime. It's the birth of a new form of social organization that challenges everything Americans believe about law, order, and democratic governance. The techniques being perfected on Water Street will eventually spread to Chicago, Boston, and every other major American city, creating a shadow economy that operates parallel to legitimate business and government. But even this systematic corruption pales in comparison to the final horror that awaits you as you reach the end of Water Street, because some of the Fourth Ward's residents have discovered forms of depravity that go beyond crime, beyond corruption, and beyond anything that can be explained by simple greed or desperation. The air crackles with a tension that goes beyond the usual undercurrent of violence that characterizes daily life in the Fourth Ward. Groups of men cluster on street corners, their conversations hushed but intense. The saloons that normally don't open until afternoon have their doors flung wide, and angry voices spill out into the street. Then you hear it. The sound that will haunt New York City for the next 5 days. A bell is ringing, not the measured toll of a church service or the urgent clang of a fire alarm, but the wild, irregular pealing that signals mob violence. Within minutes, the sound spreads throughout the Fourth Ward as more bells join the cacophony, and you realize you're witnessing the beginning of the deadliest urban riot in American history. The New York City draft riots of 1863 have begun, and Water Street is about to become the epicenter of violence that will leave hundreds dead and reveal the true depth of rage that has been building in the Fourth Ward's desperate population. The immediate cause of the riots is the Civil War draft lottery, which began on July 11th, and quickly exposed the class inequalities that have been festering beneath New York's surface. Under the new conscription law, any man whose name is drawn must serve in the Union Army, unless he can pay a $300 commutation fee that allows him to hire a substitute. $300 in the Fourth Ward, where men are lucky to earn $300 in an entire year. This fee might as well be $3 million. The message is clear. Rich men can buy their way out of military service, while poor men must fight and die for a cause that many of them oppose. But the draft is merely the spark that ignites a powder keg that has been building for decades. The Irish immigrants who make up the majority of the Fourth Ward's population have watched as their economic opportunities have been systematically limited by discrimination and competition from enslaved labor in the South. They've been told that the Civil War is being fought to free enslaved people, but many fear that freed slaves will migrate north and compete for the same low-paying jobs that Irish immigrants depend on for survival. The anger isn't just about economics. It's about dignity, respect, and the feeling that their sacrifices and suffering have been ignored by a society that views them as expendable. The same politicians who now demand that poor men fight for the Union are the ones who have allowed the Fourth Ward to fester in conditions that wouldn't be tolerated for livestock. The first target of the mob's rage is the draft office itself, but the violence quickly spreads throughout Manhattan as years of accumulated grievances explode into the street. But nowhere is the violence more intense or more personal than in the Fourth Ward, where rioters have intimate knowledge of every source of their oppression. The mobs that form on Water Street aren't random collections of angry individuals. They're organized groups led by the same criminal figures who have been profiting from the neighborhood's misery for years. Gallus Meg emerges from the hole in the wall with a crowd of regulars armed with clubs, bottles, and stolen weapons. Kit Burns closes Sportsman's Hall and leads his patrons toward the homes of draft officials and wealthy Republicans who supported the conscription law. But it's Tommy Haddon who proves most effective at channeling the mob's rage in profitable direction. The same organizational skills that made him successful at Shanghaiing now help him coordinate attacks on targets that offer the greatest potential for looting while avoiding areas where military resistance might be strongest. The violence begins with attacks on symbols of authority, draft offices, police stations and Republican newspaper offices, but it quickly evolves into something far more personal and deadly. The mobs begin targeting individuals who represent everything the Fourth Ward residents resent: wealthy Republicans who supported the war, Black Americans who might compete for jobs, and anyone else who seems to be benefiting from a system that has abandoned the poor to their fate. The attacks on Black New Yorkers are particularly horrific, revealing the depth of racial hatred that economic desperation has created in the Fourth Ward. The colored sailors' home on Water Street becomes one of the first targets as rioters burn the building and attack any Black residents they can find. The violence spreads to homes, businesses and institutions throughout the city as mobs hunt down Black Americans with a ferocity that shocks even hardened observers of Fourth Ward brutality. But the rioters don't limit their attacks to racial targets. They also turn their rage against the wealthy neighborhoods uptown, marching through the streets with stolen weapons and makeshift banners that express their contempt for the class system that has oppressed them. Rich man's war, poor man's fight becomes their rallying cry, as they attack mansions, carriages, and anyone who appears to be benefiting from their suffering. The city's response to the riots reveals the complete breakdown of civil authority in New York. The police force, never adequate for controlling the Fourth Ward under normal circumstances, is quickly overwhelmed by mobs that number in the thousands. Many officers simply abandon their posts, while others join the rioters rather than risk their lives defending a system that has never adequately compensated them for the dangers they face. The state militia, which might have been able to restore order, has been sent to Pennsylvania to fight in the Civil War. The few federal troops stationed in New York are too few to control a citywide uprising, and many are reluctant to fire on American civilians even when those civilians are committing acts of extreme violence. This power vacuum allows the Fourth Ward's criminal organizations to operate with complete impunity. The Swamp Angels emerge from their underground lairs to participate in looting
operations throughout Manhattan. River pirate gangs abandon their boats to join mobs attacking waterfront businesses. Even the more sophisticated criminal organizations led by men like Mose Humphrey see the riots as opportunities to settle scores with rivals and expand their territories. The violence that erupts during the riots goes far beyond ordinary criminal activity. It's an explosion of class rage that has been building for decades, expressing itself through acts of cruelty and destruction that seem designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on the social order that created the Fourth Ward's misery. Wealthy homes aren't just looted, they're systematically destroyed, with mobs taking special pleasure in destroying symbols of luxury and refinement that their owners will never be able to replace. Artworks are shredded, fine furniture is burned, and family heirlooms are smashed with hammers and axes. The destruction seems less motivated by a desire for profit than by a need to inflict pain on people who have lived comfortably while others suffered. The attacks on individuals are even more disturbing. Wealthy Republicans are beaten unconscious and left naked in the streets. Black Americans are tortured and murdered with a cruelty that suggests the attackers are trying to inflict as much suffering as possible before allowing their victims to die. Even women and children aren't spared as mobs attack anyone who seems to represent the system they blame for their oppression. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of the riots is how they expose the complete breakdown of community solidarity in the Fourth Ward. While some residents participate enthusiastically in the violence, others try to protect their neighbors and maintain some semblance of civilization. These divisions create conflicts within the neighborhood that are almost as violent as the battles between rioters and authorities. Women like Gallus Mag find themselves in positions of unprecedented power as traditional male authorities flee or are overthrown. But rather than using this power to protect vulnerable residents, many female criminals use the chaos to settle personal scores and expand their own criminal enterprises. The hole in the wall becomes a headquarters for some of the most extreme violence as Gallus Mag leads attacks on targets throughout the Fourth Ward. The riots also reveal the true nature of the relationships between the Fourth Ward's criminal organizations and the political system they've corrupted. Many of the politicians who have been taking bribes from criminal organizations suddenly find themselves targets of the same criminals they've been working with. The corruption that seemed to benefit everyone involved proves to be a thin veneer over class antagonisms that explode when economic pressures become too great to ignore. Police officers who have been accepting payments from gambling operations and brothels discover that their criminal partners view them as symbols of oppression rather than allies. Judges who have been taking bribes to dismiss criminal cases find themselves hunted by mobs that see them as representatives of a legal system that has never provided justice for the poor. The breakdown of these corrupt relationships creates additional chaos as criminal organizations that had been cooperating in illegal enterprises turn against each other when the social order that facilitated their cooperation disappeared. The riots become not just attacks on legitimate authority but civil wars within the criminal underworld as different factions compete for control of territory and resources. As the riots continue for day after day, the violence becomes increasingly random and senseless. Initial political motivations are forgotten as participants become caught up in the excitement of destroying everything that had previously seemed permanent and unchangeable. Buildings are burned not because they represent specific grievances, but simply because fire is exciting and destructive. People are attacked not because of their individual actions or beliefs, but because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The mob mentality that takes hold during the riots transforms ordinary residents of the Fourth Ward into participants in acts of violence that they would never have contemplated under normal circumstances. The children of the Fourth Ward prove particularly susceptible to the contagion of violence. Boys who have grown up witnessing crime and brutality suddenly find themselves with opportunities to participate in activities that would normally be forbidden to them. They join adult mobs, carry weapons, and participate in attacks on people and property with an enthusiasm that horrifies adult observers. But it's the girls who provide perhaps the most disturbing spectacle, as many abandon whatever pretense of respectability they had maintained to join in orgies of destruction and violence. Some participate directly in attacks on victims, while others provide support services for male rioters, cooking, cleaning, and caring for wounded participants in between battles with authority. The riots finally begin to subside on July 16th when federal troops arrive from Pennsylvania and begin the systematic suppression of mob violence. But the restoration of order comes at a tremendous cost in human life and property damage. Official casualty figures list 119 deaths, but many historians believe the true number was much higher as many victims were never found or identified. The property damage is estimated at over $1 million, an enormous sum in 1863 dollars, but the psychological damage to New York's social fabric is incalculable. The riots have revealed depths of class and racial hatred that many residents never suspected existed. They've demonstrated the complete inadequacy of the city's law enforcement and governmental institutions. Most importantly, they've shown that the desperate conditions in neighborhoods like the Fourth Ward create dangers that threaten the entire city. The aftermath of the riots brings temporary changes to the Fourth Ward as city authorities make efforts to address some of the conditions that contributed to the violence. Police patrols are increased, some of the worst tenements are condemned, and charitable organizations expand their activities in the neighborhood. But these reforms are superficial and short-lived. The fundamental economic and social problems that created the Fourth Ward's misery remain unchanged. The political corruption that allowed criminal organizations to flourish continues. The class inequalities that fueled the riots persist and in some cases become worse. More importantly, the riots have demonstrated to the Fourth Ward's criminal organizations that violence can be an effective tool for achieving political and economic objectives. The techniques developed during the riots, mob organizations, systematic destruction,
Psychological warfare against civilian populations become part of the repertoire that criminal gangs use in their ongoing conflicts with each other and with legitimate authority. The riots also create new opportunities for criminal entrepreneurs who understand how to profit from social chaos. Men like Mose Humphrey use the breakdown of normal business relationships to expand their influence and establish new forms of political corruption. They recognize that the fear generated by the riots makes legitimate businessmen and politicians more willing to pay for protection and stability, even if that protection comes from criminal organizations. Perhaps most significantly, the riots establish precedents for using racial and ethnic hatred as tools for criminal and political manipulation. The techniques used to incite violence against Black Americans during the riots become models for future campaigns of intimidation and terror. The success of these techniques encourages criminal organizations to cultivate racial animosity as a weapon for controlling territory and eliminating competition. As you walk through the Fourth Ward in the days following the riots, you can see evidence of the violence everywhere. Burned buildings, broken windows, bloodstains on the cobblestones that no amount of rain seems able to wash away. But the most disturbing evidence is in the faces of the people you encounter. They've crossed lines that can never be uncrossed, participated in violence that has changed them permanently, and witnessed the complete breakdown of the social order they had always assumed was permanent and unchangeable. The Fourth Ward after the riots is a different place than it was before. Not necessarily worse, but certainly more honest about the violence and hatred that had always lurked beneath its surface. The pretense that civilization could coexist with the conditions that existed on Water Street has been abandoned, replaced by an acknowledgement that desperate people will do desperate things when pushed beyond their limit. But even the unprecedented violence of the draft riots pales in comparison to the final horror that awaits as you complete your journey through the Fourth Ward. Because some of the neighborhood's residents have taken the lessons learned during the riots and used them to create new forms of organized brutality that make the spontaneous violence of July 1863 seem almost civilized by comparison.